There have been many times in my life where I've wished I was a witch. When I was a child and I would dream that I could fly. Or as a teenager, I'd wish that I could stop time to save myself from embarrassing class presentations. But by far the time when I would most have liked to be a witch was when I was in my early 20s, single and living in London. And when I tell you the men that I had to deal with on like a daily basis, I could have used some spells or potions or at the very least a broomstick to make a swift getaway. But this isn't about me. No, today I would like to introduce you to one of my favourite witches, Circe. Welcome to another episode of A Witch Lives There. I'm your host, Izzy Naylor, singer-songwriter, witch enthusiast, and this is a really interesting story. I'm a big fan. What can I say? I'm a stan of Circe. I'll say before we start, there are a lot of names in this, and I may pronounce them wrong, so apologies. I've been trying my best. I looked them up online. I can only go so far. I cannot simply go to the past and figure it out. Greek legend and mythology has brought us many interesting gods and goddesses, many surpassing simply being deities of ancient lore and becoming main characters of their own modern stories. Circe is one of those infamous characters. She's an ancient Greek witch and a lesson to us all to not mess with a woman scorned. Greek legend says that Circe was the daughter of Helios, the Titan sun god, and Perseus, or Perse, an Oceanid, or like ocean nymph, and, quote, daughter of the ocean. Circe was the sister of King Aeetes of Colchis, and her niece was also the enchantress Medea, who was the daughter of Aeetes, and who was also perhaps an even more notorious sorceress than her aunt. Circe is described as a beautiful goddess, but she was also fearsome. She was able to bewitch men with just her voice, and not only was she skilled at working the loom, she also had a talent for creating potions and magical drugs. In a poem, the Argonautica, I think. Circe invited Jason, Medea, and their companions to her halls, where they showed her a bloody weapon that Circe knew would have been used to brutally kill Medea's own brother. Circe pretty much immediately realized that they wanted to be purified for this murder, and so she purified them of the sin by slitting the throat of a suckling pig and letting the blood drip on them. Medea then told Circe of their tale, but omitted the murder. However, Circe was not fooled and ordered that Jason, Medea, and their companions leave her island immediately, but she promised not to be an obstacle on their way on account of their kinship, despite not approving of their actions. Circe was also known to be a jealous and vengeful lover. At one point, she'd actually fallen for a mortal, Pisces, who was apparently very faithful to his wife, Canaan's, and he fiercely rejected Circe's advances. Circe was so angry at this that she turned Pisces into a woodpecker, and unfortunately Canaan's, unable to fight through her unbearable loss and sorrow, threw herself into the river Tiber just 3 days later. There was another story of a sea god named Glaucus who was in love with a beautiful nymph, Scylla. But Scylla would not return his affections no matter how hard he tried. So Glaucus went to Circe and asked for a magical potion that would make Scylla fall in love with him. But like in so many tragic romance stories throughout history, it turned out that Circe herself was smitten with Glaucus, and like a classic love triangle, he didn't love her back and turned down her offer of marriage. He said to her that while Scylla was alive, his love for her would not falter until trees grew in the ocean or until seaweed sprouted on mountains. Enraged, heartbroken, and probably a bit embarrassed, Circe planned to take her revenge. She used her knowledge of herbs and plants and mixed a potion, chanting her spells over it. Then she put on a sea blue cloak and travelled to the pools where Scylla liked to take her baths. She poured her monster-producing potions into the water and spoke her mysterious spell out loud. Scylla arrived not long after, but it wasn't until she was waist-deep in the water that she realised her lower half had turned into rabid dogs and that she'd been transformed into a hideous monster. We later hear of the monster that Scylla turns into in Homer's Odyssey. Circe lived on the island of Aea, or she was possibly sent there. Some say this was punishment for her husband's death, but the island was wild and heavily wooded, inhabited by lions and wolves who had once been men until Circe transformed them. It is here where most stories about Circe take place, and definitely the most famous story about Circe in Homer's Odyssey. After losing all but one of his ships in a horrendous encounter with a tribe of man-eating giants, Odysseus and his men landed on Circe's island. The men were exhausted, so they rested on the shore for 2 days and 2 nights. But when dawn broke on the 3rd day, Odysseus took his spear and sword to a high outlook in the hopes of seeing some evidence of life on the island. But the only visible sign was a column of smoke rising from somewhere deep in the woods. So naturally, he decided to send half of his men as a scouting party, led by Odysseus's second-in-command, Eurylochus. So this scouting party of half of the men, about 22 in total, went deeper into the woods until they reached Circe's house. And as they got there, they were surprised to find fearsome beasts, mostly lions and wolves, slouching and acting like tame, domesticated pets. As they drew even closer to the house, they heard a woman singing sweetly inside while working at her loom. So the men called out to the beautiful voice, and Circe came and opened the doors and welcomed them in. But Eurylochus sensed a trap, so he stayed outside. Even so, the others were brought in and made some delicious fancy wine. The men drank this greedily, but unbeknownst to them, Circe had mixed in some of her evil drugs. Once they finished drinking, Circe all of a sudden struck them with her wand and turned the men into pigs, although their minds remained human. Having been watching in horror, Eurylochus ran back to the ship to tell Odysseus of the men's doom. He begged those remaining to flee, being sure that they would face the same ill fate. However, Odysseus just could not sit back knowing that something terrible had happened to his men, so he set off down the road alone. As he walked through the woods, he was all of a sudden met by Hermes, who offered to help him. He gave Odysseus a magical black-rooted, white-flowered plant called moly, which he said would make Odysseus immune to Circe's spells. So Odysseus continued and reached Circe's house. He stood at the gates of the fair-tressed goddess and called out to her. Again, Circe came to the door and welcomed him in. She prepared him a potion in a golden cup and put in a drug. But when Odysseus had finished drinking, he was not bewitched, just as Hermes had said. So when the enchantress pulled out her wand to turn Odysseus into a pig, he took his chance and rushed at her with a knife in his hand. Circe, in an effort to distract him, then invited Odysseus to her bed, but he first made her swear an oath that she wouldn't harm him, and she immediately agreed. After this, he was given food in abundance, but he just couldn't bring himself to eat, as his men were still pigs. So he said, "Circe, what man that is right-minded could bring himself to taste of food or drink, ere yet he had won freedom for his comrades, and beheld them before his face? But if thou of a ready heart dost bid me eat and drink, set them free, that mine eyes may behold my trusty comrades." So Circe went to the sty and anointed each man with another charm, and the pigs became men again. Circe then told Odysseus to go back to his ship and store his goods in caves, then return to her with the remaining men. So he did this, and after a brief argument with Eurylochus, who still didn't trust Circe for good reason, all of the men then followed Odysseus to Circe's house. She bathed and anointed the no longer pig men with oil, and gave them fleece cloaks and tunics and let them all feast in the hall. The men then remained with Circe and her handmaidens on the island for a whole year until they started to urge Odysseus to ask Circe to allow them to leave and return home to Ithaca. Circe agreed to help him, but advised him that he first must visit Hades. He needed to see Tiresias, a blind prophet who would tell him what fate awaited him in Ithaca. So Circe gave him everything that he would need to get to the underworld and communicate with the dead, and then she bid him and his men farewell. But they did return to Aea once more after that, where Circe informed them that they would have to sail past the island of the Sirens and gave them instructions on how to pass them safely. So she sent Odysseus and his men off one final time on a favourable wind. According to classical tradition and other stories, Circe bore Odysseus 3 sons, Agrius or Agrius, Latinus or Latinus, and Telegonus, although some sources only mention the latter. The story goes that when Telegonus was old enough, Circe informed him that his father was Odysseus and sent him off to find him. But Circe, being probably a worried mother, gave him a poisoned spear so that he would come to no harm. When Telegonus eventually reached Ithaca, he killed some cattle, and Odysseus came to defend them, not knowing that this was actually his son. So then tragedy struck, when, with the poisoned spear given to him by Circe, Telegonus wounded and accidentally killed his father. He's obviously heartbroken, and so together with Odysseus' wife Penelope and their son together, Telemachus, Telegonus returned to Aea to bury his father's body. After the burial, Circe made the 3 of them immortal, and then, on the advice of Athena, she married Telemachus, and Telegonus married Penelope. Keeping it in the family, I guess, but I don't really want to think about those age gaps. In another version of this story, Circe actually used magical herbs to bring Odysseus back to life, and in return, Odysseus gave his son Telemachus to Circe's daughter Cassiphone to be married. Later, Telemachus got in some big argument with Circe and ended up killing her. Cassiphone then killed Telemachus to avenge her mother's death, and on hearing all of this, Odysseus died of grief. Since the original story of Circe and Odysseus, she's been heavily featured in both ancient and more modern art. She's mostly depicted as a beautiful woman, often with a potion in her hand. Her story has been turned into classical ballet and has been turned into more recent shows as well, with the revival of ballet in the 20th century. And there are also operas telling her story. And then more recently, there's a book that I've read by Madeline Miller called Circe, which is basically just a retelling of her story, from her past as a daughter of a titan to being banished, and then to meeting Odysseus and having a son. And then she also goes on a few other adventures. It talks a little bit about the Minotaur, which is her sister's child. It's a good book. I definitely recommend it if you're into sort of Greek mythology and retellings of classic tales. Over the years, the original story of Circe has been interpreted as a cautionary tale against drunkenness, and she's also been taken as the archetype of the predatory female. But now we see her more as a sexually free woman, and she's depicted as such in the arts from the Renaissance time to modern times. So at the end of the day, do I wish I had the power to turn some men into pigs? Yes. But also, a lot of them kind of seem to do a good enough job at acting like pigs already, so they don't really need me or Circe to do a little magic spell. That was a joke. If you're a man, please don't get mad at me. But also, am I joking? Who knows? So that was the story of Circe. There's probably so many other retellings of her story, but she's definitely most famous from Homer's Odyssey. If you have any other cool historical witches or stories that you would like me to talk about, then please get in contact. My email is awitchlivestherepod@gmail.com, and I'd love to have a look at some other cool witches that you recommend. I hope you found this enlightening, interesting, entertaining, perhaps all of the above, or maybe you've just found this incredibly annoying, in which case, I don't know why you're still here. Weird of you to stay if you didn't like it. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode. I would love to have you again listening to the next episode, which I don't know what it's about yet, but you'll find out in a week or two, and I'll find out probably at the same time. I don't really know what I'm going to talk about, but I have a list, so it'll be one of those things. So until then, I am going to cast a spell on you to not turn into a pig, but to turn into someone who wants to listen to me yap. Thank you.